Good morning and welcome to the IMF, to this session, Analytical Corner, the catalytic impact of IMF lending on development assistance. My name is Noha El-Gabali. I work here at the IMF's Communications Department and I will be your moderator. Before we start, if I can ask you to please silence your phones. My colleagues Phil and Augustin will come up to the stage and they will present for about 10 minutes. Afterwards, we will open the floor for a 15-minute Q&A. At the time, if you could please raise your hand and give your name and your affiliation, and then someone will come with a microphone for you to ask a question. With that, please join me in welcoming my colleagues, Augustin and Phil.
Thank you. The past few decades have witnessed significant improvements in both lifting income levels and advancing human development outcomes in the world's poorest countries. School attendance has grown, health outcomes have been enhanced, and social safety nets have been expanded. This progress has in part been achieved with the help of development assistance, that is, financial support in the form of grants or concessional loans from the international donor community.
Given that domestic savings in low-income countries are typically low and access to international markets limited, many of these countries rely on development assistance to help meet their development goals and close balance of payment gaps. Consequently, development assistance has been one of the primary sources of external financing in these countries, worth on average 6% of GDP in recent decades.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Phil Johnston, an economist in the Finance Department.
And my name is Agustin Velázquez, an economist at the Strategy, Policy and Review Department here at the IMF.
And we would like to talk to you today about what happens to development assistance when low-income countries request a program from the IMF. Does IMF lending help attract additional financing? And if so, which donors are catalyzed? And then what we found is that IMF support and development assistance has a special relationship. The graph behind me shows annual flows of development assistance as a share of GDP to low-income countries from 1990 to 2019, separating between countries with and without an IMF program. On average, low-income countries engaged in an IMF program, which are the countries in the green bars, received nearly double the levels of development assistance compared to those which were not under an IMF program, which are those in the red bars. Another way of visualizing the association between IMF program participation and development assistance received is by looking at the experience of individual countries. The graph here shows the evolution of development assistance to Togo as it participated in 4 IMF programs from 1990 to 2019. Flows of development assistance during program years, which are those shaded in orange, are on average higher than flows during off-program years, which have no shading.
Let's now discuss the channels through which IMF lending can help attract development assistance. There are 2 main mechanisms at play here. First, the conditionality and monitoring of an IMF program facilitates the implementation of a wide range of policy actions and reforms. These can serve as a signal to donors regarding the authorities' commitments to macro stability. Second, the monetary lending from the program itself can be used as a way to ease the burden of the adjustment to these policies and reforms, and be used also as a financial buffer against future shocks. Both channels can attract development assistance, as donors may view their contributions as being more effective in a reform-prone environment.
Given that both development assistance and IMF lending increase in times of crises, identifying the causal impact of an IMF program on development assistance is challenging. To solve this, we relied on statistical techniques using statutory variations in the IMF lending rules to estimate the catalytic effects.
We looked at IMF lending to low-income countries spanning from 1990 to 2019 and sought to answer 3 questions. First, how large is this catalytic effect of IMF lending, and how has it evolved over time? Second, which are the main donors that are catalyzed when the IMF lends to a low-income country, and which is the aid type that they provide, either grants or concessional loans? And third, does the size of the IMF loan matter for the amount of development assistance that's being catalyzed? Regarding our first question on the size of the catalytic effect, what we find is a significant magnitude. IMF disbursements worth 1 percentage point of GDP, we find that it catalyzes development assistance worth 2.7 percentage points of GDP. And this is quite a striking result. So this is, just to put it in different words, and this is the main takeaway of this presentation, relative to the size of the economy, every $1 of IMF lending attracts nearly $3 from additional support from the international donor community. Furthermore, this 2.7 percentage point of GDP, the catalytic effect of IMF lending, has remained broadly stable over the past 30 years. Now, considering the second question on which donors can be catalyzed when the IMF lends, what we find is that multilateral organizations emerge as the primary contributors to this catalytic effect. And among these, the World Bank as a first, and also the EU appear as the 2 largest contributors. As a second group, we also analyze the catalytic effect on traditional bilateral donors. Think, for example, OECD countries. And we find that there's also a catalytic effect in those countries, but half to the extent of those of multilateral organizations. As a third category of countries, we also analyze the catalytic effect on non-traditional bilateral donors, so non-OECD countries. And we don't find very significant amounts of catalytic effects in this group of countries. So what type of aid are these donors providing? What we find is that donors provide assistance in the forms of grants 2 times more frequently than in the form of concessional loans. Finally, moving to our third question on the importance of the size of the IMF loan. What we find is that the catalytic effect of the IMF lending increases as a function of the size of the loan and the size of the disbursements, but it has decreased in returns. This means that a larger program attracts more development assistance than a smaller program. But a smaller program attracts more assistance per dollar lent.
So in conclusion, our results show that IMF lending to low-income countries has a robust and sizable catalytic impact on flows of development assistance to the recipient country. And just to restate our main result, for every $1 of IMF lending, it helps catalyze nearly an additional $3 of extra support from the international donor community.
The current set of global challenges, ranging from geoeconomic fragmentation to cross-border conflicts and exposure to climate shocks, threatens to stall or even reverse the advances made by the world's poorest economies. And this is a big concern. This is why it's important that the international donor community is adequately funded.
At the same time, we know that advanced economies are facing their own financing constraints and competing demands. And it's all very complicated to manage. And this is why we asked to ensure that there is adequate financing of development assistance to low-income countries, including through the IMF's Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, which is the IMF's primary source of lending to the world's poorest countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Phil and Augustine, for this very informative presentation. Does anybody have a question? Gentleman right there.
Thanks. Steve Lewarne, USA.
Could you please state your name and your affiliation?
Steve Lewarne, USAID. What? Okay. There's an assumption here that grants are better than loans. Is that correct? Okay. So when there's an IMF program, you say there's double the amount of grants that there are loans, right? Did you look at the efficiency of either one versus the other on the development of the country itself?
Thank you for this question. No, we didn't look at. So what we look is at the flows coming into the country in terms of ODA, and then we have a breakdown by type of either it's grant or concessional loan. But there's no judgment if one is better than the other one. It's just like the total net flows on how it's being attracted.
Thank you. Any other questions? Lady right there. Can stand up, please.
Hi, my name is Ashley. I'm a master's student at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS. And from this presentation, I gathered that IMF lending catalyzes 2 times the amount of grants. And looking back, grants and loans have many benefits, obviously, to the state. Despite these likely benefits, it's also possible that continued over long periods of time, large amounts of aid and the way it is delivered makes it more difficult for good governance to develop because of the various constraints that come with it. So as the IMF, what type of policies have you put in place to avoid dependence on these grants, loans, and aid?
Thank you.
I mean, low-income countries face very significant external financing challenges. At the moment, they're gradually recovering from a series of shocks, be it the economic scarring of the COVID pandemic or the war in Ukraine. And so to the extent that development assistance can help close an external financing gap, it will limit the size of a needed fiscal adjustment in response to a shock, and so will thereby help protect the poorest and most vulnerable in a society.
Also, in terms of the overall international donor architecture, we have the different things. You can think grants are better for the lending country, but at the same time, concessional loans, are being repaid and then lent in different rounds. So there's also a benefit from this type of dimension. In terms of the specific IMF programs, and each program is tailored specifically to address a challenge of the country. So we don't. I don't think there's like a particular tailoring to other if the support comes in the form of grants or concessional loans. So assistance is assistance.
Yeah, just to add, so the size of each IMF program is determined by a few factors. One of them is the size of the balance of payments need in the country in question. Another is the kind of the capacity to repay from the recipient country back to the IMF. And the third main driver is the overall strength of the program, so the overall kind of the strength of the reforms envisaged in the program. And those drive the kind of the overall size and overall lending of the program. And programs do very much vary in size and are tailored to the individual circumstances of the country in question.
Thank you so much, Phil. There's a question up here, please. Gentlemen. Go ahead.
Thank you. Abdullah from ED office. I'm an advisor of the ED office. My question is the decrease of the development assistance after each program is coming from improving in economic conditions after the IMF program, or is it coming from I would say, the end of conditionality of those development assistance because of the ending of the IMF program? Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah.
Thank you for your question. Overall, it's quite challenging to identify the impact from IMF lending to development assistance. So what we did in this empirical setting is we based on country year values in terms of development assistance and both IMF lending in terms of the amount what is lent and disbursed. And we focus on the period where the program is active. So we don't know if there is an impact after the program finishes. So this is that will be still the benchmark. So we're comparing years within the program with years without the program. And also, in terms of the dynamics, we basically are evaluating, our main result is an average across countries and across time.
Thank you. Any questions? Any more questions? There's one in the back there.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Akilu from Ethiopian Banks. As you know very well, that there has been different development assistance for low-income countries so far. However, poverty still continues in these countries. So what do you recommend that the development assistance, be it loan or aid, can bring changes as you sought for? Thank you.
So the question is, what role can development assistance play? So you're right. I mean, the drivers of, I guess, change in a society and the extent to which there's growth or poverty reduction are often very much determined by internal factors within the country itself. And also countries can obviously be hit by shocks, as I referenced COVID, the war in Ukraine. Development assistance is, for low-income countries in particular, can play an important supporting role in helping to close external financing gaps, but it's not the sole determinant of how whether a country succeeds economically or not. So I would say that the role of development assistance is to help support a country to deliver on its development objectives, on its plans, on its vision for the future. But the fundamental kind of driver and impetus is very much coming from within the country, which is, I guess, when you talk about an IMF program, that's where the conditions that are tailored to that particular program are focused on the key issues in that country in question and the reforms that could be implemented to help both boost growth but also poverty reduction in that country in question.
Thank you, Phil. We have the lady up here in white.
Hi, my name is Leila Almaragi. I'm from Mennonite Economic Development Associates. I want to thank you guys for your presentation and for the great research. My question kind of follows from Abdullah's a bit, in the sense of, it's a question of sustainability. So in the off-program years, you see a huge drop, which speaks, of course, to the effectiveness of the IMF programs, but also to the lack of sustainability in those off-program years. So my question is really an avenue for future research. Is there a plan to explore how to create, have lasting impact even after, the lending sort of ends?
Well, I guess this question will pin down on what kind of assistance these countries are receiving. So overall, what we also want to highlight in our research is the coordinating mechanisms that the IMF has in the international donor community on kind of highlighting which the countries are going through the most hardship. So they request the IMF program, and this helps coordinate and kind of alert other countries on the deep issues that this country is facing. So if you provide grants, this helps fill in the balance of payment gaps, but at the same time, the grants don't have to be repaid, whereas concessional loans do have to be repaid, but at the same time, they're beneficial because this is also another form of additional financing. So we don't know what would happen if every specific country were to take a concessional loan or not. That would depend on that sustainability issues. That we analyze them here at the DSA in the IMF, but that I think falls out of the scope of this project.
But just to add to that on the sustainability, I mean, that's part of the intention of the IMF program itself and the design, is that the particular conditions which are included and the conditionality in the program will vary from country to country, but it'll be trying to strengthen, let's say, the country's domestic revenue mobilization or investments in social safety nets, etc. So the intention is, at the end of the program, that the country is in a more sustainable position. So I mean, low-income countries generally typically have protracted balance of payments problems. And so the goal, essentially, of IMF lending to low-income countries is to help address those BOP issues. There's not necessarily an expectation it will be resolved by the end of the program, but the aim is to facilitate the implementation of economic policy advice, which would help restore external balance while also boosting growth and poverty reduction.
Thank you, Phil. I have one quick question also. From your findings, what are the implications on middle-income countries?
Well, different from middle-income countries, low-income countries really rely on development assistance. So it's very important for them from the external financing perspective. Middle-income countries do have, on average, more access to international markets. So you imagine that with an IMF program, the catalytic impact, or the most important relevant or economic meaningful impact, will be on private capital flows. So these are where you think most of the weight will be put on to manage to close balance of payment gaps.
Thank you so much. I think we have one last question here.
Oluwatobi Ogunbayo from Nigeria. My question is, the difference between the global north and south is access to finance. So what percentage of your portfolio goes as grant, and what percentage goes as concessionary loans? Then secondly, how do you avoid increasing the debt burden of these countries, in terms of your concessionary loans? And then thirdly, I would like to ask, how do you kind of increase the funding for these LDCs, to help, meet their challenges? Thank you.
Thank you. several questions.
So in terms of IMF lending to low-income countries, or IMF lending in general, it's all concessional loans rather than grants. So the IMF doesn't provide direct grants to low-income countries. So that's your first question. To come to your second question, how do we then avoid a situation where IMF lending is kind of worsening a debt situation? Well, IMF lending to low-income countries through the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, at the moment, the interest rate is 0. So all the 69, well now 70, all the 70 countries that can borrow from the PRGT pay 0 interest rate. So in terms of the debt burden for the countries, it's very limited. And the repayments only come between 5 and 10 years after the first disbursement has come in. So it's a very concessional interest rate that countries can borrow at. And so I've forgotten what the third part of the question was, sorry.
Said the difference between grants and
How can
which
they attract more
percentage?
finance?
he was asking a question about which the percentage of grants go.
The third one is, what percentage of the portfolio goes to the grants and what goes to the concessional loans? What percentage?
Well, the IMF portfolio is all loans. It's all concessional loans at 0 interest rate.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, we're running out of time, so before we close, I wanted to ask the two of you, what is it that you absolutely want people to leave this room remembering from your presentation today?
Sure. So when low-income countries borrow from the IMF, they not only secure access to additional liquidity directly from the IMF, but they're also able to leverage wider support from the international donor community. And this effect is very substantial. For every $1 of IMF lending is able to attract nearly $3 of wider support from international donors, which can help the recipient country address their macroeconomic stabilization.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very
Well,
much.
thank you all for being
Thank you.
here. And this is our last analytical corner presentation for the annual meetings. I hope to see you all in spring meetings next year.